Hey everyone. I want to talk a little bit about cryptocurrencies. And a lot of people ask me, I just don't get it. I don't understand what's going on. Why are people raising so much money? What are these tokens for? How many of you guys have heard about decentralized autonomous corporations? Or the term? Perfect. This is a good presentation then. In order to understand kind of the craziness going on behind all of this fundraising, right, or crowd sales, you need to kind of understand about the companies or the organizations behind it. A lot of people, they're starting research, but they're just not getting to the right place. They're jumping into, digital assets, they're the future, can transfer money, and they're buying things they don't understand. And I think that that's really important that we move away from that. So I want to talk a little bit about what these tokens are, what they mean, and how these decentralized autonomous corporations function. Before I get into it, obviously my name is Brendan Bloomer. I've been a venture capitalist, and for the last 12 years I've been involved in virtual currencies inside of big online video games. I've been involved in real estate, and about 2 years ago, as I mentioned, I moved into the blockchain space. So this is the existing structure that dominates centralized technology platforms. As you see, you've got one side, you got value creators, and the other side, you got value extractors. They're all coming together through some type of central server platform. This is a really familiar structure, and just about, in fact, the majority of NASDAQ resides on this structure, right? Putting it in the context of Uber, for example, you would have the value creators over there being the drivers, sending their information to a central server, and on the right side, you'd have the riders that were extracting value from the platform. And fiat is being transferred to a centralized entity, and of course, the reason that these companies are doing it are for profit. So a portion of the profit, or all of the profit, goes up to shareholders. And this structure is really, like I said, everything from Uber to Facebook, Airbnb, they all reside on exactly the same structure. And what you have here is a split between the users and the beneficiaries, right? And that creates a huge degree of misaligned interest. The only reason that these companies or shareholders are putting forth the products are for the money that they can make. And that is the entire business plan, is to maximize profits. And that drives our whole economy. But not only do you have misaligned interests, you have profits give the only reason for service, and there's no user vested interest. The users don't really care about the success of the company in which they're using that product for, right? They don't care if Uber goes up. They don't care if Uber goes down. All they care about is getting from point A to point B, right? And that's their involvement with the organization. And that's the limited vested interest that this centralized structure is able to take advantage of. So moving to decentralized autonomous collectives, I also like to call it open source organizations. You really have the same parties involved, but you've removed the centralized entity completely, right? And we close the economic loop of that company with a token structure, right? So instead of sending money to a centralized body with fixed fees on both sides and then having a fixed profit margin, these companies can introduce a token, right? And I talked a little bit about this yesterday, but existing centralized companies, when they design their product, they have to design around the constraints of the existing fiat currency system, right? So USD, we don't think about this, but it has a lot of limitations, right? Transfer costs are high. I need to go through wire. They're slow. That's why we pay employees at the end of the month. Has anyone asked why we don't pay a person every second, right? That's a constraint of the existing financial system, and we build our products around those constraints. But what's going on with these open source organizations is that the currency itself can become part of the product design. And that can do a lot of very interesting things. It can make everything transparent, auditable, completely trustworthy or trustless, and 100% inclusive, right? When everything is open source and everything is able to be viewed, anyone can add value to that business. Anyone can pop up and say, what if we do this? What if we add this feature? How about we add this line of code? At the end of the day, all of these technology companies are just formulas, right? And we've seen how open source software and open source development has just skyrocketed the acceleration of technology, right? Because we're not reinventing the wheel anymore. And anyone can come in and step in and add a good idea, and it can be adopted by the greater public. So what happens when you do that to a company, right? When you're competing Uber now, we're competing with Uber with everybody as your employee. Every bit of your code is auditable. Anyone can make suggestions. And if those suggestions are good, they can be forked right in. Right? That's really what these decentralized autonomous corporations or collectives really represent. And they do some really interesting things when you start to bridge the users and the beneficiaries. Right? By using a token, for example, let's look at an Uber model. Imagine every single rider, right, paid in a native currency or a native token of the actual organization itself, right? And then every rider receives that token, and then they sell it back to people that need to have rides, right? Now you've just completely closed the economic loop, and you have maximum efficiency. But you've also done some other very interesting things. You've completely aligned the interests of everybody in the organization. And you're leveraging a larger pool of innovation. We've already talked about that. But you have unprecedented vested interest. Every single person involved in that corporate ecosystem is now invested in the success of that organization. That is creating unbeatable, right? Unbeatable vested interest. How do you compete with an Uber that's owned by all of its riders, right? And all of its drivers? How do you even begin to, right? When you have a sliver of that kind of vested interest in a traditional shareholding structure. And we're seeing it happen already. So I want to jump straight into examples, because I think examples are some of the best ways to understand what's going on and how these things are functioning. I want to look at Steemit. So Steemit is a very interesting project. It is a content network where everything that you see on steemit.com is actually on the blockchain. It is a blockchain itself. In fact, this website has no central server. It is actually a block explorer. I don't know if you guys have ever seen something like Etherscan, where you actually can go in and read what's going on the blockchain itself. That's what this website is. Everything is on the blockchain. Every piece of content, every like, every interaction. And it lives in a completely decentralized capacity in which nobody can shut it down, nobody can take control of it, and it is accessible by everybody. It removes the ability to censor data completely. So blockchain is becoming part of best practices. In 5 years from now, if you don't timestamp your articles on the blockchain, you're going to be considered a fraud. If you don't put your content on the blockchain, you're going to be considered a revisionist or someone that censors material, right? This is becoming a part of best practices, and these organizations will become something that people can trust at a degree that you can't trust centralized entities. So Steemit's a really phenomenal project. Every time you actually create content and you put it on the blockchain, every day a certain amount of tokens are emitted from the network, right? And those go to all the content creators proportionate to how much the public has upvoted or liked that content, right? And if you want to advertise on that platform, right, like you would promoting a post on Facebook or Google AdWords, you need to buy tokens from those people that have created content. Now you've just completely closed the economic loop. There is no profit, right? Profits can represent pricing inefficiency. When you're paying, a shirt costs $5 and you're paying 10, 5 of that is essentially wasted and has gone to the people that did the work to actually bring you that product. But when the community is doing the work itself, you don't need to think about things like that. So it becomes very difficult for centralized entities to compete on a pricing level and on an innovation level. Pure plays is another great example. It is an industry that is kind of controversial, but gambling. What it allows is to put everything on chain. So think about, you go online to a casino, anything, whether it's poker or sports betting or anything you can imagine, right? And you give an entity money, and then they tell you the outcome, whether it's a slot machine or whatever. Putting it all on the blockchain makes it 100% auditable. And this is completely owned by token holders, meaning there is no owner of this company, right? And so by putting it on the blockchain, it essentially allows provable odds, right? Now we don't need to trust the entity to say, oh, did they actually give me 49.5% odds? Everyone can go and audit everything that's actually happened in that company. How does a centralized entity compete with that degree of trust? Not to mention the fact that it has no central servers and completely resides on the blockchain itself. Once again, these websites are just block explorers. So businesses are actually becoming blockchains, and the blockchains themselves are the business. Everything resides on the chain. And that makes it not controllable by any individual person and not dependent on any centralized entity. EOS is another example, obviously, something that I'm associated with, but it is a platform where you can actually build these decentralized autonomous organizations. And I want to dive a little bit into it because I want to explain why tokens are valuable. So many people say, why would I want a token, right? Well, the tokens are the network. In a proper decentralized autonomous corporation, there are no shareholders, there are no management, there's nothing. They are the token holders, right? That network, the token holders are the complete beneficiaries. And so they have complete decentralized governance, right? Why would I want a token? What does it do, right? In most of these decentralized autonomous organizations, they're controlling the vote, so they decide what happens, what forks into it. Imagine a decentralized Google, where if Google wanted to make a change to its algorithm, it would have to be voted in by distributed consensus. So they couldn't do things that the public didn't want them to do. They couldn't access our data in ways the public did not want them to access it. And even further, they can actually direct value for future growth. So most of these decentralized autonomous corporations are biologically self-sufficient. And what that means is that, for example, we can add inflation to a network. In EOS's example, after 1 billion tokens are distributed, every year 5% more tokens are distributed to the network. And anyone can propose a smart contract. So any one of the people in this audience could come in and say, hey, I think that we should spend new tokens on this. You can pay this entity, and I will do marketing, and I will do all of these things for the platform. And if the network decides that they want to allocate value to you, just by a simple vote, the network is sufficient in the sense that it creates its own value. It mints these new tokens and distributes them, right? In the case of Ethereum, for example, with a $20 billion valuation and an 11% inflation rate, this is already happening. Ethereum is allocating $2 to $3 billion a year in decentralized budgeting, right? That's an incredible degree of biological self-sufficiency that we've never seen. These networks don't depend on anything. They are completely autonomous code that in some ways are unstoppable. But you can do just about anything. I was talking about a centralized example of me putting a proposal forth and saying, hey, I want to do these things for the network. But I also could just write a whole decentralized autonomous corporation itself on how to use those 5%. I could create a whole other business in which proceeds went through a decentralized structure and were distributed to hackathons and invested into projects. All these things done by the public in a completely transparent way, right? What we're really moving into is the era of open source companies and the types of innovations that you're seeing with open source technology, the explosion in development in projects like GitHub. I'm sure all of you have heard, right? The core of open source. It allows us to all build on each other's work. In the future, when I wake up, I may not even have an employer. I may be able to just work for absolutely any company in the world that I can add value to, right? Imagine that. You wake up and say, I have a great idea to Airbnb. You examine the code, you start writing something, right? And you put it out there, the public accepts it, forks you in, the network pays you a bounty. Now you've got a decentralized network, a piece of code that has essentially just hired you, that has taken your ideas, has incorporated it into the organization, right? And you have been paid, and they don't even know who you are, right? So how do centralized entities compete with this? In my opinion, they can't. And I actually believe that decentralized autonomous organizations will, at some point in time, we're talking longer horizons, will disrupt every single centralized alternative, every single centralized entity. So this just gives you a little bit of an overview on kind of why tokens matter. These tokens represent ownership or stakeholder or beneficial interest in the network. A lot of people say, are these tokens securities? Are they not? Well, you can't, it's not binary. These tokens are anything you want them to be. And we talk about regulation. We say, how are we going to regulate these securities? Are they securities? Like, the reality is we need to look at the traits of each and individual token because everything is so different. I can use a token for security. Blockchain Capital just released a token for BCAP. It is a digital security. And when you hold that token, it actually represents underlying security interest in a fund, right? Some of these things have nothing like that. They represent the need to contribute to the network. Some tokens have work associated with holding them in order to maximize their value. For example, in Steam. If I hold a bunch of Steam and I'm not adding value to the platform, I'm losing Steam, right? So we need to, a lot of talk around regulation, which is why I want to jump into it, It's just, we need to understand everything that's possible with this technology. And we need to build a regulatory framework that is extremely dynamic and can look at things on an individual basis and understand what we're dealing with. We're not just dealing with one thing. We're dealing with shares, commodities, new types of application tokens. We're dealing with all sorts of things. The blockchain is going to replace everything. So I just wanted to share a little bit of an example, and now I want to open up to questions about decentralized. I think that it's important to just kind of live through examples. And if I go through Airbnb, Uber, all of these types of things, I can give you an example of you can start to learn what a decentralized alternative would look like. And you start to ask yourselves, can the existing centralized entity compete with the decentralized autonomous network in which it is owned by all of its users and its riders, its drivers, its content writers? When you have millions of people that are invested in making something successful, how does a group of 100 shareholders compete with that? And my belief is that you just can't. So anyway, questions, please. Yes?
Thank you for the presentation. Can you just elaborate a bit more on when you said there's no profit in a decentralized app, please?
Yes, a great question. So I wouldn't say that there's no profit. And profit is just one form of value, and value can be distributed in so many ways. Right? For example, if I have a token network, the network itself, when it consumes tokens incoming, it could just delete those tokens so that there's less tokens in supply. That's an effective way of distributing value back to the token holders. So profit is just one way of distributing value. Another way is to lower the cost of goods and services. So as beneficiaries, right, become the users of the platform themselves, profit doesn't become as important. So let's look at insurance, right? So in the future, you're going to be insured by all of our peers. Our premiums are going to be cut in half because there's no profit associated with those companies anymore. And premiums are going to go in half, and we're going to be deciding, people are going to be submitting claims, and whether or not we pay those claims are going to be decided by the very people that are submitting claims themselves. It's not going to be a centralized entity where you hire a doctor and you say, deny everyone you possibly can, because we want to make as much profit. So profit is just one form of distributing value, and when the users become the beneficiaries, it's not as important anymore. There's so many different ways. Now, obviously, decentralized networks can still have profit. If you do have profit and you're distributing profit to tokens, which is absolutely capable within the blockchain space, I would say that would put you into security territory, and you would need to treat your digital asset like a security, right? And this goes into each and every coin being very different and needing to understand exactly what it is and what's it doing to understand how you even begin to regulate it, right? Does that answer your question? Any others? Yes.
Been around for quite some time, and I see that with the support of this technology, you can obviously do it with an efficiency and a scale you've never been able to run a normal cooperative before. But cooperatives are subject to inefficiencies. I mean, from the Indian farmer organizing himself to buy a tractor to various other different forms, they're plagued by inefficiencies. And so I'm curious if, as we move to the future that you talk about, if those inefficiencies don't use the benefits that you talk about.
That's a great question. I think that the big difference between cooperatives and where we're at now with the blockchain is the blockchain, in the sense that it gives everyone a full sense of what's going on and really everybody a full picture in order to contribute. It also removes the need to trust absolutely anyone. Cooperatives were never able to achieve that. But the second part of your question was, sorry. Yes, the inefficiencies of decentralized governance. So we're in a time between centralized governance and decentralized governance, and we're not even close to real efficient decentralized governance. In the future, a company will be able to say it'll need to make a decision, and you may have 1 million token holders, and through artificial intelligence and learning and neural nets, you'll be able to say, oh, we need to ask these 10 people, right? That's the long-term future, but we're so far away from that. And that's why, if you look at a lot of these governance structures, we've even been toying with things that are too complicated. We know that not everything can be a presidential election. We know that the public doesn't always make better decisions than a centralized group. And that's why the design of each individual decentralized autonomous corporation is so important. Because if I create something where the whole community is just electing 3 groups, right, to do the centralized portion for me, I've essentially decentralized the top layer, but I'm actually allowing centralized bodies within the whole ecosystem to perform those functions. Bounty systems, when the network says anyone can add value, if you can do this, we will pay this amount. A centralized entity can step up and say, I'll fill that function for you, right? So it's really a combination, the full stack of decentralized governance with centralized, execution. But that is exactly where we're at. I would say if centralized governance being efficient here, we're just starting to explore what decentralized governance can do. And as we continue to go forth and we have more robust technologies and these formulas can learn from the decisions being made by the public, it will continue to become more and more and more decentralized. And eventually, you'll have layers and layers and layers that will be these incredibly complicated and complex mechanisms, these huge overarching formulas that govern, for example, an entire insurance agency, right? Where the game theory has been tested on every single component of every single layer so that you're able to operate in a completely decentralized fashion. But you're right, we're very much in between. And the amount of decentralized governments that we can pull off at the moment and execute in a way that is more efficient than a centralized body is very limited. But at the shareholder level, at the vested interest level, what I'm seeing is that the companies moving into this space, when you're moving into content, the growth that I have seen, companies like Steemit having 100,000 users a day in 3 months, I've never seen anything like it in my life. And the only justification for this is the fact that they have 2 million people that wake up every morning and think that they have beneficial interest and tell their friends that, hey, this is where we're going, right? So we're just starting, and you're right, for a lot of things, and for most things, centralized decision-making is still far more efficient.
Just wonder that several central banks have conducted a study on doing their own digital currency.
Yes.
What do you think about what's pro and con, and what's actually impacts on your concept?
Well, using the blockchain, you said central banks? Using a blockchain for, yes, for countries to implement their currency on a blockchain makes a lot of sense to take advantage of, the double spending. But that's really in the lines of using it almost as enterprise software to just deliver a better product. The thing that I don't understand in terms of how central banks will really adopt and move towards cryptocurrencies is a lot of the things that we love cryptocurrencies for, the trust, the auditability, the inability for people to print capital, the inability for people to insert themselves and influence it. That is something I don't know if central banks are ready to deal with. Now using the blockchain or putting, for example, the US dollar on the blockchain through some type of tether vehicle and allowing people to transfer it around so that we don't need central entities. If you think about it, if you've transferred, if you outside of the blockchain, anytime you've ever transferred money, there's been at least two parties involved, right? A bank, maybe 2 banks, or PayPal, and the US government, right, who's now issued that. So I think that they can use it to basically make their existing fiat systems more efficient. But I will be surprised if anyone comes out and says, we're moving towards a cryptocurrency protocol or a digital asset protocol, which we have no control over. The blockchain represents a loss of control, and that's why it's so exciting, because it restores it to the masses. This is a technology that is a vehicle for the masses to take back control over things that have been deciding for them for so long. Yes?
I appreciate the benefits of decentralization, but if the ownership basically goes to the users, where is the incentive for the initial investment, and how are they ultimately going to get that back?
That's a great question. And the truth is there's no right answer to that question. I believe in what I'm calling a publisher model for decentralized autonomous corporations. I believe that these DACs, as DACs I call them, are like MMORPG video games. They're like big online video games in the sense that you bring millions of people together in a video game. And what is that technological infrastructure output? It uses the community and the technology to deliver entertainment to everybody. But these are very similar, except they're outputting, right? Real-world problem solving or provision of goods and services. So they look and function very much like MMORPG video games. So I actually think that a centralized entity or even a decentralized development team can spend time creating these things, potentially years, on their own dime, and essentially write blueprints on how these things function. And in the process of distributing the tokens to all the people that will then be the beneficiaries of that network, that can be a monetization event to pay for the initial investment that went into the years of development in order to deliver that to the community.
So, following on from this point, is the real transfer, in your view, of wealth going to happen between the value-added group and the owners, ultimately? Because currently, like in Uber's example, for example, shareholders are reaping the benefits of Uber.
Correct.
But equally, in your system, in a decentralized system, it's whoever adds value most technically will get paid, in the lack of a better word, most. So is this the real transfer between capital owners and value added?
Yes. I think that, well, to answer your question, just to repeat your question, he said, is the value going to transfer from shareholders in a traditional entity to the users of the platform? And I think absolutely it will. The way that it transfers to the user of platform, there's actually so many different, all of these decentralized autonomous corporations right now, make no mistakes, they are experiments. Right? There is so many untested social engineering concepts going on here. So a lot of these things are left to be seen in terms of how that's going to happen, but we can see that it is happening. So yes, I think that when you have a group of shareholders, right, that represents very little of the user base itself, it's just inherently inefficient, right? The users don't care about it other than to extract value. The shareholders don't care about it other to extract value, right? And so there's no alignment of interests, and you're very limited in what you can do. And as those come together, right, and what we're seeing is that correct product design of decentralized autonomous corporations is to ensure they do come together, right? The value transfers, it's not that it transfers from one to the other, they become the same people. So the value just is contained within the same group of people that are actually using the platform.
So I like the question that I think a gentleman posed before about cooperatives, because to some extent they were the first form of corporate organizations in the Middle Ages in the 13th or 14th century. So I'm always struck by the fact that we present decentralized organization as this new big thing. It's actually was the first kind of organization to have created through trust or cooperative and so on. And actually, limited liabilities companies in the 19th century where to some extent was allowed the huge industrial revolution by mobilizing capital, by protecting IP, by incentivizing investors and so on. So, and I think you recognize that yourself at the beginning when you said, there's a lot of bubble effect currently and a lot of money pouring into, the DAOs and ICOs of the world and so on. But at the same time, you seem absolutely adamant that, the whole society is going, towards that. And there's absolutely, I didn't hear the thing of doubt in the industry. And I still don't understand why you are absolutely so sure that, these models that kind of protect also innovators and companies like huge successes like the Apple of the world and so on is completely doomed to failure.
So Apple, that was not part of the, so eventually I do believe companies like Apple will even fall to decentralized alternatives, but they're a second tier because they're not a technology platform. Technology platforms are the most ripe for disruption. You mentioned a couple things, I'll address them one at a time. I didn't mention the word bubble, but I do believe decentralization will consume everything. When you actually look at the market cap of the whole decentralized world, it's about $88 billion right now. And I think that is extraordinarily small for the impact that the blockchain and decentralization is going to have on society. The problem is that there's not many products on the shelves. So there isn't a whole lot of cryptocurrency. You guys have probably only heard about 3 or 4 themselves. When you look on an individual project basis, I think that some of these things are too expensive. I also think that the main problem, outside of not being a bubble, is that people are investing in things they don't understand. We realize this is the new internet. You've read every investment banking paper that says it will completely change everything. Harvard Business Review is saying it's a new fundamental technology that will eventually take over everything. And people are seeing this and they're buying into it. And they're buying into it with not enough knowledge. So I think that people need to be educated before they're jumping in. And I think we're at a tricky point in time where there's a lot of products that are very overvalued, but there's a lot of projects that are very undervalued. So it's a little bit of both, and it stems from the fact that people just don't understand this space as well as they need to. Regarding your point on cooperatives, the way that blockchain works is through code. So you need to look at it. Let's put the cooperatives in the example of code. So a long time ago when you had co-ops, right? What we realized is it made a lot more sense to get everyone in the same room because of the communication benefits associated with centralized execution, right? And the decision making of a single hierarchy, all these types of things. Well, what the blockchain allows us to do is have the best of both worlds. Because everything is on the code, I don't need to be communicating with everybody because I can see everything. So it's completely solved the communication problem. We don't need to be in the same office because we're all working on the same piece of code. So what we're really saying is in a world run by code, right? When code is contract, we're moving away from legally binding to technologically binding. Code is a much better expression of intent. If you think about it, we're all turning into coders. Every time you get on a chat and you do slash emoji, you're coding, right? And so what we're doing is we're coding these companies, and because it's so transparent, and because it's so auditable, and everybody can work on it at the same time, communication is ubiquitous. So co-ops never really had the ability to do this, so I don't think that they can be compared to DAOs in a fair way that you could even say that this type of functionality was around. The best way to look at it is the blockchain is what makes co-ops work, in my opinion. Yes?
Putting a token on a blockchain is one thing, or a hash of some content, or even a small computer of smart contracts, such as the ones that run ICOs.
Yep.
But earlier in your presentation, distinct, were you suggesting that the content itself was on-chain?
Correct. So every piece of content is on-chain. It is immutable. It can't be censored. And anyone can vote for that and say, I like that content. And that's how Steemit derives value. In the future, we may find much better algorithms to determine what is the most valuable piece of content. It's relatively simple right now. But the network could fork in those changes anytime they wanted to. So yes, absolutely everything is on-chain. It doesn't exist anywhere outside of a decentralized network just the same as Bitcoin.
If that's replicated everywhere, surely that does not scale?
Yeah. And what do you mean?
If you've got 100,000 videos and you want to replicate them to 10,000 nodes, for example, surely holding content on-chain just doesn't scale up.
Yeah, this is why I'm running EOS. So EOS is a proof-of-stake blockchain that can scale to millions of transactions per second. I am not a believer in proof of work. So you've probably heard of Bitcoin and Ethereum. We're running at, they're able to perform somewhere between 5 to 15 transactions per second. And the actual cost of those networks per transaction is somewhere between $3 to $7 US. They're actually the slowest, most expensive networks we've ever built. And so I believe in the shift to proof of stake, but I actually believe that the technology, in order to scale to what you're talking about, to encompass every business, every piece of content, every piece of data in the world, is actually being developed right now.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Assuming that we can get all of this working, and even assuming that there would be some centralized or authority, or you wouldn't need a centralized authority to make the system work. Have you given some thought to whether or not a perfectly efficient system is really what we want? I mean, if I gave you the answer to a movie or the end of a movie as soon as you started it, life would be a lot less fun. I mean, there is a lot of like humanity is built into our inherent inefficiencies, and have you given that some thought?
Yeah, I think about it all the time. And this is the same kind of discussion that happened when we came around the internet. We said, do we really want people transferring data around all over the place? You know, I always show in my presentation for Introduction to Blockchain is a Newsweek article from 1995 that says the internet will fail. And around the perimeter of the article is a bunch of drug users, like illicit activity. I mean, the internet was invented for governments to communicate with each other. When we initially started talking about the internet, we're like, what does this mean? Do we really want people transferring around information all over the place? We wouldn't be able to control the public, right? This is just a further extrapolation of that type of technology. I think a better question to ask, opposed to whether we want this degree of inefficiency, because I think everybody would have a different answer in this room, is are we going to be able to control humanity to start marching towards inefficiency? Any other questions?
You mentioned transparency as one of the upsides. How do you predict that businesses would
well to sacrifice being able to be confidential negotiations?
That's a great question. And he said ultimate transparency. Would businesses really want this degree of ultimate transparencies? The answer is centralized businesses will not. But these aren't centralized businesses. And it's a trade-off. Yes, there's a certain degree of, oh, well, now we're showing our underwear and stuff, but that's what open source code is. And the benefits is that everyone can contribute, everyone can think, and everyone can fork in things. Now, these networks themselves have the ability to be designed with certain aspects non-transparent. But that non-transparency is transparent in the sense that everyone knows this and this it can happen, and it's provable that that's going on behind the scenes, right? But it can be left, there can be layers of you can black box things within these networks. They can be designed in any way you imagine. All right, thank you guys very much. Appreciate it.